It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, the Right Honourable Sir John Major. He's well known to all of us through his political career in particular, where he has probably held every major appointment in the cabinet, including that of Chancellor, but culminating in serving as our Prime Minister and as leader of the Conservative Party from 1990 to 1997. I'm also pleased to say that in addition, his current activities include being a president of Chatham House since 2009, and he chairs our panel of senior advisors. This evening, we are privileged to be hearing his first public speech since the UK voted to leave the EU. Sir John, I think, is uniquely qualified to outline just what Brexit does mean, what it means for Britain and for Europe. You may remember that during his time as Prime Minister, he was the one who negotiated the opt-outs for Britain, both from the single currency and from the social chapter. I remembered hearing him speak here at Chatham House on a subject very similar to this back in 2013, where he defended the decision of the government of the day to have a referendum on Europe, and he outlined where he believed the prior negotiations before that referendum should focus. Quite prescient in the issues that he highlighted at that point. He also declared himself to be, and I quote, neither a Eurosceptic nor a Europhile. And I think that, in my view at least, makes him all the more worth listening to in this climate where we face the backdrop of highly politicized debate. So please join me in welcoming Sir John Major to speak on the topic, Britain and Europe, a reality check.
Well, Deanne, thank you, and good evening, everyone. Eight months ago, a majority of voters opted to leave the European Union. I believed then, as I do now, that was an historic mistake, but it was one once asked that the British nation had every right to make. The government can't ignore that decision and must now shape a new future for our country. Some changes may be beneficial, others may not. A hard Brexit, which is where we appear to be heading, is high risk. Some will gain, others will lose. Many outcomes are going to be very different from present expectations. We'll find, to take but one example, that for all the social pressure for immigration control, economically, we will need the skills of immigrants. The referendum was probably one of the most divisive votes in all British history. It not only divided the four nations of our United Kingdom, but opened up divisions within those nations, within political parties, within neighbourhoods, within families, between age and income groups, and among friends. It won't be easy to heal those divisions and unite our nations, yet that is what we need to do. In Scotland, I believe a hard Brexit will encourage a second referendum on independence. This may seem improbable at this moment, but it would be reckless to ignore the risk. And as we saw last June, emotion and national pride can overcome economic self-interest. If Scotland were to become independent, both Scotland and the whole of the United Kingdom would be diminished. That cannot be ignored as Brexit evolves. And of course, the same is true of Northern Ireland. Many, many years of painstaking effort went into the Irish peace process, which, even apart from Brexit, is now in a fragile moment. Uncertainties over border restrictions between Ulster and the Republic are a serious threat to the UK, to the peace process, and for Ireland, both north and south. A special deal is going to be necessary. I will return to those important issues on another occasion. As I voted on the losing side in the referendum, I've kept silent since last June. This evening, I don't wish to argue that the European Union is perfect. Plainly, it isn't. Nor do I deny the economy has been more tranquil than expected since the decision to leave was taken. But I do observe that we haven't yet left the European Union. And I've watched with growing concern as the British people have been led to expect a future that seems to be unreal and over-optimistic. Obstacles are brushed aside as if of no consequence, whilst opportunities are inflated beyond any reasonable expectation of delivery. Now, I am no longer in politics. I have absolutely no wish to re-enter it in any capacity. I do not seek publicity. More often than not, I shy away from it. But I can't ignore what I learned in government, nor can I forget the people who voted to leave Europe in the belief that it might improve their lives. If events go badly, their expectations will not be met, and whole communities will be worse off. The particular fear I have is that those most likely to be hurt will be those least able to protect themselves. So I have two objectives this evening: to offer a reality check on our national prospects and to warn against an over-optimism that, if it is unachieved, will sow further distrust between politics and the public at a time when trust needs to be rebuilt. It would be better to underplay rather than overplay expectations. The post-referendum debate has been deeply dispiriting. After decades of campaigning, the anti-Europeans won their battle to take Britain out of Europe. But in the afterglow of victory, their cheerleaders have shown a disregard that amounts to contempt for the 48% who believed our future was more secure within the European Union. Remain voters are of all political persuasions and of none. Over recent months, many of them have written to me in dismay, even despair. They are people from every walk of life who have every right to their view, every right to express it, and every right to have their opinion represented and tested in Parliament. The 48% care no less for our country than the 52% who voted to leave. They are every bit as patriotic. But they take a different view of Britain's future role in the world and are deeply worried for themselves, for their families, and for our country. They simply don't deserve to be told that since the decision has been taken, they must keep quiet and toe the line. A popular triumph at the polls, even in a referendum, does not take away the right to disagree, nor the right to express that dissent. Freedom of speech is absolute in our country. It's not arrogant, or brazen, or elitist, or remotely delusional to express concern about our future after Brexit. And nor by doing so is this group undermining the will of the people. They are the people. Shouting down their legitimate comment is against all our traditions of tolerance. It does nothing to inform and everything to demean, and it is time that it stopped. Our Parliament exists to scrutinise the executive. That's a large part of its job. So it's depressing to see Leave enthusiasts in Parliament acting against their own principles. To win the referendum, they asserted the sovereignty of our own Parliament. Now they speak and vote to deny that same Parliament any meaningful role in shaping, in overseeing, or in approving the outcome of our negotiations in Europe. Our Parliament is not a rubber stamp, and it shouldn't be treated as if it were. As a former parliamentarian, I believe the negotiations to come are so crucial to our nation's future that the government would be wise to take frequent account of public opinion through parliamentary debate. Now, of course, don't misunderstand me, of course, neither Parliament nor public can micromanage the negotiations. We must trust ministers to do so, and they must have flexibility as they do so. But Parliament must be free to debate and comment and advise. For it not to do so would be wrong in principle. It would also be unwise politically if, as it might, the will of the people evolves and the reality of Brexit becomes unpopular. The hopes of those who favoured leaving the European Union are sky high. We are told, I quote, that countries are queuing up to do trade deals with us, that our best days lie ahead. It all sounds very enticing. And for the sake of our country, I hope the optimists are proved right. But I'm not sure that they will be. My own experience of international negotiations and the national self-interest that invariably accompanies them makes me doubt the rosy confidence being offered to the British people. Negotiations are all about give and take. We know what the Brexit supporters wish to take, yet we hear nothing about what our country may have to give in return. If anyone genuinely believes that Europe will concede all we wish for and exact no price for doing so, then they are extraordinarily naive. As I consider the complexities that lie ahead, the words of Kipling come to mind. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. It is the detail, the what and the why, the when and the how, and the where and the who, that is key to the success of these negotiations. And to avoid later recriminations, the British public needs to be made aware now of the hurdles ahead and what different outcomes will mean for their future. Let me turn directly to the politics of exit. Leaving the European Union isn't just about trade. It will have political consequences as well. For over 40 years, British foreign policy has been based upon the twin pillars of our relations with the United States and with the European Union. To be straddled between these two economic and political giants has served our interests well. Outside the European Union, we become far more dependent upon the United States, and for 4 and possibly 8 years, upon a president less predictable, less reliable, and less attuned to our free market and socially liberal instincts than any of his predecessors. As a boy, I was taught that America was our greatest ally, and throughout my life, I have seen her as so. But America's size and power means that we are, by far, the junior partner. Mostly we follow, only rarely can we lead. And despite the romantic view of committed Atlanticists that special relationship is not a union of equals, I wish it were, but it isn't. America dwarfs the United Kingdom in economic and military power. Sadly, that is fact. Once we are out of the European Union, our relationship with the United States will change. She needs a close ally inside the European Union. Once outside, that can no longer be us. And that may not be the only change. If we disagree with American policy, we may, I say may, weaken our ties with them. But if we support it slavishly, we become seen as an American echo, an invidious role for a nation that has broken free from Europe to become more independent. And inevitably, such is life and politics, there will be disagreements with the United States. The US wished to contain China and engage Russia. We wish to contain Russia and engage China. We seem likely to disagree on refugees, on free trade, on the legality of Jewish settlements, and on climate change. how many disagreements can there be before even the closest of ties begin to fray? Until now, the world has seen the United Kingdom as a leader within Europe. We are the second largest economy, with hopes one day, maybe 15 years away, but one day, of overtaking Germany. We are one of only 2 nations with significant nuclear and military power. We have the widest and deepest foreign policy reach of any European nation. So in Europe, we have often set policy: the single market, enlargement to the east, restraints upon expenditure, together with a host of less prominent policies. Our role within Europe has magnified the power of our nation state. Once we leave, that will no longer be so. Now, the Prime Minister knows all this. Her policy to maintain a good relationship with Europe after exit is surely the right policy. But at some time, she will have to face down those who favour total disengagement and who have never accepted our role within Europe. For some, a total divorce has been a decades-long ambition. I believe they are utterly wrong. And although today they may be allies of the Prime Minister, the risk is that tomorrow they may not. I am no dedicated Europhile. As Deanne told you earlier, I said no to the euro and no to Schengen on open borders. But I've never doubted the importance of cooperation with a successful Europe. And in voting to leave, we have done the European Union great harm. For the loss of the UK will weaken the European Union, especially when set against the superpowers of America and China. For the first time, the European Union is contracting and not expanding. It is about to become smaller and less relevant. And without the United Kingdom, it may also change in character, becoming more protectionist and less of a pillar of free trade. Such a Europe would be damaging to British interests. Our departure is also adding to domestic political problems across Europe. Britain has rejected the colossus of the European Union. This has energized the anti-European Union, anti-immigrant nationalists that are growing in number in France, in Germany, in Holland, in Italy, in Greece, and in other countries. None of these populist groups is sympathetic to the broadly tolerant and liberal instincts of the British. Nonetheless, post our exit, their pitch is straightforward. If Britain, sober, stable, moderate, reliable Britain, can break free of a repressive bureaucracy in Brussels, why then, so can anyone. It is a potent appeal. I caution everyone to be wary of this sort of populism. It seems to be a mixture of bigotry, prejudice, and intolerance. It scapegoats minorities. It is poison in any political system, destroying civility and decency and understanding. Here in the UK, we should give it short shrift, for it's not the people we are, nor the country we are. Whatever grievances exist, the United Kingdom and Europe cannot ignore one another without mutual damage. As the Prime Minister has intimated, our future self-interest is to cooperate on all aspects of security, on terrorism, on crime. We should take a common position on climate change, on human rights, and on representative democracy. We should continue to cooperate over the migrant surge to Europe and contain Russian misbehavior. The plain truth is this: irrespective of Brexit, the UK benefits from engagement with Europe, not isolation from Europe. And both parties have an interest in ensuring that is maintained. My hunch is that over the years ahead, the political price of leaving the European Union may turn out to be greater than the economic cost. That said, to protect our interests, the trade negotiations will require statesmanship of a very high order. There is a real risk that the outcome will fall well below the hopes and expectations that have been raised. Regrettably, I see little chance that we'll be able to match the advantages of the single market in the negotiations to come. In my own experience, the most successful results are obtained when talks are conducted with goodwill. It's so much easier to reach agreement with a friend than with a quarrelsome neighbour. But behind the diplomatic civilities, the atmosphere is already sour. A little more charm and a lot less cheap rhetoric would do much to protect the interests of the United Kingdom. The negotiations will begin with the costs of disengagement. These could be politically explosive. During the referendum, the Leave campaign promised to, I quote, take back control of huge sums of money and pay an additional $350 million a week to the National Health Service. Many believe this. And yet the bitter irony is that the divorce settlement, that is, the costs of leaving Europe, may involve paying out much larger sums of money than this. The European Union chief negotiator has estimated that our bill for exit may total between 40 to 60 billion euro. Now, let me say immediately, I find that figure very contentious. But the bill will be substantial. It'll be billions, not millions, and very unpalatable. It will come as a shock to voters who were not forewarned of this, even in the recent White Paper. One Member of Parliament has referred to the estimated divorce payment as a threat. His argument being, I quote, you pay to join a club, but not to leave it. Now, of course, that is true. But when you leave any club, you are obliged to settle your debts. And that is what the European Union is going to expect the United Kingdom to do. There are liabilities to be met, pension costs, legacy costs, contingent liabilities, a proportional share of work in progress. The European Union will argue that we have a legal obligation to pay these bills. They may be right, but the issue, frankly, is not clear-cut. Some of the European Union's claims seem to me to be highly questionable. And unless there is a political agreement, any dispute may have to be resolved in court. An agreement would be preferable. And if she sanctions one, the Prime Minister will deserve support against any criticism she may receive. The European Union chief negotiator has also warned that the separation costs must be agreed before any detailed trade negotiations can even begin. I must say, I doubt he will be able to sustain such a hard line if we're prepared to engage in constructive talks. But we shall see. But if there is a standoff, perhaps because of a backlash against the size of the exit bill, then trade talks may have to await a court decision, be delayed indefinitely, or scrapped altogether. In either event, the faint hope of a comprehensive trade deal by spring 2019 will have gone. Without such a deal, three options arise. We can leave the European Union with a flimsy, inadequate deal, hastily cobbled together. Or we can seek a transitional relationship, perhaps for 3 to 5 years, for which, as non-members, we would have to pay. A minimum option would involve staying in the customs union and submitting to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Or we can trade with the European Union on a World Trade Organization basis. the more one examines probabilities, the more contentious becomes the task of leaving. Some of the most committed Brexit supporters wish to have a clean break and trade only under WTO rules. This would require tariffs on goods with nothing to help services and nothing to inhibit non-tariff barriers. This would not be a panacea. For the UK, it would be the worst possible outcome. But to those who wish to see us adapt to a deregulated, low-cost enterprise economy, it is an attractive option and wholly consistent with their philosophy. However, it has worrying implications for public services such as the National Health Service, and for the vulnerable, who I'm delighted to say the government has pledged to help, and I know how personally the Prime Minister is committed to this. So there is a choice to be made, a price to be paid. We cannot move to a radical enterprise economy without moving away from a welfare state. Such a direction of policy, once understood by the public, would never command support. It would make all previous rows over social policy seem like a minor distraction. A new trade deal with Europe will be hugely complex. No one should envy the Secretary of State and his negotiators. Some industries, cars, aerospace, hope for special, perhaps industry-to-industry deals for their exports to Europe. The difficulties of this are legion. The chances of success are slim, not least since the German Chancellor is likely to rule out sectoral deals. And even if she doesn't, WTO rules expect agreements to cover all trade, not just a few hand-picked sectors. Many practicalities arise. Even a partial customs deal with Europe would not eliminate the need for country of origin certificates, or border checks, or certification that regulations are met, or other frustrations, none of which exist at present. And any deal we reach must be agreed by the other 27 nations of the European Union, each with their own national interests. No one can be certain how long this will take. A conclusion within 2 years is very, very, very optimistic. Business needs to factor that into their plans. And domestic political hurdles arise as well. If cars and aerospace were to get favourable deals, why not textiles and widgets? How would the government soothe the ire of those not receiving preferential treatment? And nor will free trade deals with third countries be straightforward. Even the most attractive options come with political hazards. In Washington, the Prime Minister discussed a deal with President Trump. Both leaders were keen, which is excellent. But the omens are mixed. Early actions confirm that President Trump has put protectionism at the heart of his trade policy. America first is more than a slogan. Tariffs between the US and the UK are already minimal. There is little scope for lowering them further. The UK runs a healthy trade surplus with the United States. President Trump may wish to narrow or eliminate that gap. That being so, British hopes shouldn't be set too high. Nor will it be easy or quick to reach agreement on contentious issues such as medicine or cars or beef raised with growth hormones. In comes American beef, out go European subsidies. That isn't going to be an easy sell to the beef industry. And then, of course, China and India are both attractive candidates for enhanced trade. But in negotiation, India for sure. India will seek immigration concessions for students and non-students alike, which prima facie is in direct conflict with government plans. China as I know from experience, is a tough negotiator and will strike a hard bargain. As she is the largest trading partner to 120 countries and the largest export market for 70 of them, a trade agreement with the United Kingdom may not at this moment be one of her main priorities. The government must also replicate the 53 free trade deals struck on our behalf by the European Union, but only for members of the European Union. They must be renegotiated, all 53 of them. So far, after 8 months, only 12 are in play. There is a very, very long way to go. And the question arises, are 65 million Britons likely to get the same favourable outcome as 500 million Europeans? I set out these difficulties, not because I don't believe deals can be done. Some most certainly can and will be done. But to be realistic about the timescale and the complexity of the huge task, the huge undertaking that lies ahead. It is crucial to business and to the public that our expectations are consistent with what can be achieved. It matters to the government too. Ministers must not overpromise. In 2 years' time, the United Kingdom will be the first nation to leave the European Union. This will be a real irony, as the first proposal for a European Union came not, as is generally supposed, from the Frenchman Jean Monnet, but from an Englishman. 3¼ centuries ago, in 1693, William Penn advocated a European Diet or Parliament as a policy to end perpetual military conflict on the continent. It took 280 years and 2 world wars to convince his fellow Britons. 43 years later, the British people reversed that decision. Let us hope for the futures of our children and grandchildren that they were right to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir John, for that hard-hitting and indeed sobering assessment of where we stand and where we might be going. We have about 20 minutes for questions. I'll just start out with one and then I'll open it up to the audience. And that is, I wonder, Sir John, how likely you think it may be that no agreement is reached, given all of those difficulties. Either that not a good enough agreement is reached, that Britain will want to sign up to it, or indeed if there is an agreement that all of the other 27 countries of the EU will ratify it.
I think the chance that no agreement is reached by the spring of 2019 is very high. I think it will be a superb piece of negotiating if we were to get an acceptable, comprehensive deal by that date. An unacceptable deal, of course, can be obtained, but an acceptable, comprehensive deal by that date, I think it will be extraordinarily hard to achieve it. And then in order to get an acceptable deal, it would mean the transition period I talked about, and remaining, I don't think we'd remain in the single market, but I think we'd remain in the customs union with the disadvantages and the advantages that brings. And that may take another 3 to 5 years in the view of many people who have studied the likely complexities more deeply than I have. So I think by 2019, very unlikely we'll have a full deal. I regret that, but I think that is the reality as it stands. One is obtainable, but it would only be after a lengthy transitional period. And whether that transitional period would be acceptable is a matter for government and parliament at a later date.
Well, so business better be thinking about a plan B, it sounds like. Question? Right in front. Could you, by the way, when you ask a question, wait for the microphone so that those not here can hear you? And also, could you give your name and
John
affiliation?
Wilson. I'm a journalist and a member of Chatham House. An excellent speech, if I may say so. My question is, do you think that when Britain leaves the EU, this will cause the disintegration of the EU and ultimately of the NATO alliance?
I don't, actually. I can see why there are fears that it might, because the European Union is not in a good state at the moment. It has a huge number of internal problems, not least the euro, the refugee problem, the difficulties of reaching decision-making, the growing conflict that exists between the European Parliament and many of the nation-state governments. There are lots of problems for the European Union to overcome. But I will tell you why I don't think it will break up. I don't think it will break up because it has been the most significant single ambition of the members of the European Union for the last 50 years to reach a position where there was unity in Europe. And if you look historically at why that happens, you understand the depth of how people feel about it. At the end of the Second World War, all Europe was bankrupt. And they looked around the world and they saw the power of the United States. And they foresaw, the wisest amongst them, the growing power of Asia and in particular China. And they realized that unless they united, they would become political pygmies in a world of giants. And that was the impetus behind the original seeds of what we now call the European Union. And successive generations have grown up with that on the continent. It is deeply imbued in their instincts on the continent in a way it never has been in the United Kingdom. So I do think whatever the difficulties, they will do everything they conceivably can to hang together rather than break up. If they broke up, 50 years of policy would be wrecked and there would be complete chaos, economic chaos, were that to happen. As far as NATO is concerned, I think the United States will continue to put pressure on the Europeans to increase their meager contributions to the collective NATO pool, and I think they are right to do so. I think many of the European nations who would not be free, but for Britain's preparedness to stand alone and the subsequent arrival of the mighty American power, they wouldn't have been free. They have an obligation to pay their fair share of the bill, and they're not doing so. I think they will be compelled to do so, and I think NATO will stick together. And when you see the way Russia is misbehaving in the East, it is actually crucially important that NATO stick together. And I think they need to look carefully at exactly what NATO does and exactly what NATO can do. But I do think it will survive. I think the European Union will survive through the difficulties that lie ahead, and they are many and various. And I think NATO will, despite some of the grumpy noises being made about it at the present time. I believe that, and I hope that.
Thank you. The lady in the front here.
Thank you. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News. Sir John, you've made quite a serious charge. You've accused the government of misleading people about how easy this is going to be. Do you think that's deliberate, or is it naive? And if I may, you know a thing or two about the internal machinations of the Tory party. You've warned Theresa May she'll have to face down the Eurosceptics at some point. Forgive my language, but to use your phrase, will she face her own bastards at some point?
You might say that, I couldn't possibly comment. I don't think there is a deliberate attempt to deceive. I think it is becoming apparent to people as they get further into the negotiations just how complex this is. The easy populist sound bites we got in the referendum campaign, that since Europe exports more to us than we do to them, they're bound to do a trade deal, was simplistic in the extreme. We actually export 12% of our GDP to Europe. They, on average, export 4% of their GDP to us. There's no doubt which is the demandeur between the two. And I think those realities are becoming clearer. I wouldn't charge my colleagues with a deliberate attempt to deceive in government. I think there was during the referendum campaign, sometimes it was quite a large lapse. But I think in government the realities are becoming apparent. And I think you've seen that with, for example, one practical example would be the remarks made by the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union the other day, when he said quite crisply and entirely accurately, it seems to me, that despite our ambitions, despite the government's ambitions to control the totals of immigration, it's going to be a very long time because those skills are going to be needed. Now, that is absolutely right, I believe. And I think that sort of frankness is very attractive, very desirable, and I hope we hear it on all fronts, because the British people voted to come out. They will accept coming out, but I think they do wish to know and have an absolute right to know what the difficulties will be, the impediments will be, and how long it will take, and what we may have to sacrifice to get it. That is essential. And I think it is in the government's interest to do that, which is why I favour the debates in Parliament. Because if you can carry people with you as the difficulties become apparent, you will carry people with you at the end when it is concluded. And if we wish to see the harmony back within the United Kingdom, and harmony reappear between public and politicians as to their veracity, then we need to be utterly frank with them, and I think that is desirable. As for the second part of your question, at some time, every government has to deal with people in their party who genuinely believe something different to the government's policy, and in that, the government has to face them down and prevail.
Okay. I'll take one in the back, and then we'll come to a couple in the front. I can see a hand, a very tall hand at the very back. Gentleman, I believe it is.
Can you take the guy next to...
Thank you. Paul Alexander, member of Chatham House. So, John Major, under what circumstances would you advocate a second referendum?
Oh, I think that's a long way away, if ever. I mean, I spoke today about the importance of Parliament being involved. When people talk about the sovereignty of Parliament, in a modern world like ours, where you have a global economy of the sort we've got, no Parliament is absolutely sovereign and never will be again. Not even the most powerful legislature in the United States is entirely sovereign. But as far as possible, you welcome the sovereignty of Parliament. So I think it is most likely at the end of these negotiations that this is a matter that Parliament would determine rather than anybody else. But a lot will depend on events that haven't yet happened. I'm not in the business of advocating a second referendum at this stage. Let us see how things begin to pan out. I think that is what is necessary. Let us see whether public opinion changes. Let us see what public opinion demands. We are all the servants of the public. The government is the servant of the public. Let us see how things pan out, what demands there are, how Parliament interprets what is happening. I think all those things must precede the question of a second referendum.
Thank you. Could we have a microphone in the front? Trish, and then the gentleman just behind.
Thank you. Thank you. Tricia de Bourgrave, I'm an opinion writer. Following on from this, what you've just answered is that the Remainers are not being legitimised in terms of their concerns, and this is a huge issue right now for most of us who voted to remain. Do you think the changing demographics, as was pointed out in the House of Lords last week, in which in the next few weeks 500,000 are going to become 18 years old, and it was 18 to 35-year-olds, the majority of which voted to remain, and 500,000 since the referendum over 65, unfortunately, I'm not saying this for anybody in this room, have passed away. Do you think changing demographics should be legitimised in such a huge, well, I'm not going to say calamity, but with the consequences? This is not a 4-year government election. This is much more than that.
As I am well over 65, the hairs rose on the back of my head as you ask your question. I'm almost too much in catatonic shock to answer. It's an interesting principle, but I think it's quite a difficult one to effectively write into law, because you might argue, well, I suppose you could argue that that does happen at every successive general election. But referendum are something quite unique. I don't think I would I would like to go beyond parliamentary consideration. You're right that the electorate will change. And the electorate, no doubt, as it changes, will express its own views to its own members of parliament. And I think those members of parliament have a duty, whether it is popular in some quarters or not, to say precisely what they believe and what their constituents are telling them. So I think I would honestly prefer to go down that particular route.
Thank you. Did you have a comment? Yes, just behind.
Thank you. Andreas Raffel, German and 30-year resident in this wonderful country. I agreed with everything you've said, and so we are where we are, in a mess. But I'd be curious to find out what's the solution, and how would you, if you were going back into politics, what would be your plan going forward? Because we are where we are, so we've got to go forward.
Oh, I'm much too wise now to go back into politics. It's an extremely good time to have been a politician. There is no silver bullet. There is absolutely no silver bullet that can put this right. We can't turn the clock back. We can't overturn a referendum vote of that scale. It just is not practicable. So we have to negotiate the best deal we can, looking at our future interests. And by looking at it, I mean looking at it with a very cold, clear eye to make sure that what we are doing is in the interests of the next generation. I pick up the previous question. They are going to be here longer than we are. And we need to look at what it actually means for them. And I think that is the right way to proceed from where we are to where we get. And I return to a point I made about the Remainers. It simply is not democratic to tell nearly half the country they can't have an opinion and they can't express it. Indeed, when the Remainers are told they are arrogant for expressing their view, I think I would turn that round. I would say the arrogance is with the people who tell 48% of our public that they ought not to express their view. So I think it is that the solution is going to be with the ongoing negotiations that are yet to come. And they haven't begun yet. The government haven't set out its negotiating position, and the European Union are not going to set out their negotiating position, I would guess, until after the French and German elections. And it may be quite a good idea to wait until then, because there may be a greater, how best to put this, flexibility once those elections are safely out of the way.
Let's see. I think there's yes, the lady in the third or fourth row.
Monica Machon, member of Chatham House. Sir John, thank you for a very enlightening and brave presentation. My question relates to the 48% that you mentioned. Are there consequences for the political systems in Britain as a result of 48% of voters feeling disenfranchised in the negotiating process, and certainly as it's presented today? And as a slightly second question, what is the role of the courts? We've seen some very interesting decisions, and how do you foresee that playing a further role?
The consequences didn't seem too great at Copeland, I didn't think. And when people come to vote in a general election, there are a whole range of issues upon which they vote. And a good deal of it is emotion and feel as to who is most secure to run the country, rather than particular policies, though from time to time particular policies take a very high profile. So I don't think there's a particular cause and effect that you suggest might be the case. I think probably that is not going to be the case.
See, the gentleman in the dark sweater. Yes. And then there's another dark sweater just up here, and I think that'll have to be our last question. Go ahead.
Marco Johnson-Pronyuk, Deloitte Consulting, and a former resident in Scotland. Given that the Scottish people voted against independence on the premise that they can stay in the EU, should Westminster allow Scotland to have a second independence referendum if Nicola Sturgeon calls for it?
Well, I'm proposing to make a lengthy speech on that very shortly, as I indicated earlier. So since I don't want to detract from what I said this evening by going off in a different direction, I hope you'll forgive me if I don't answer that tonight. I promise I won't keep you waiting too long for an answer.
And that'll give you a little more time to think about the answer.
No, I know the answer, but I don't want to say it tonight.
Yes, sir.
Ambrose Fix, fund manager. I just picking up on your comment about the elections in France and Germany, particularly in France. How, if Le Pen did win, do you think that would change the negotiating position?
Well, it would change the European Union if she carried out her policies. I think that is the point. And I think it would be the most devastating blow to the European Union were France to have a government that sought to leave the euro and possibly to leave the European Union, but certainly to leave the euro. So I think that would dwarf almost everything, and I think you would have to look again at precisely what's going to happen. I think she may do very well in the election. I would be surprised if she were to win it. But I do offer one thought about that. Why are we seeing this great growth of nationalism and intolerance right the way across Europe? I think there are a number of factors, and one of them that perhaps is not mentioned as often as it might be is the impact of the financial crash of 2007. For the last 10 years, the majority of people in most European countries have had no net increase in their disposable income and no net improvement in their family assets. Now, in every decade since the 1920s, per decade, people's net income rose by about 20%, 2% a year by and large, about 20% every decade. In the decade from 2007 to 2016, it rose 1.6%. What has happened in the last decade is of a measure different to anything we have seen within the life scale of anybody recently, and it is unsurprising that they are dissatisfied with what has actually happened. And they have shown that dissatisfaction. There are all sorts of attendant things you can hang to it. Clearly, migration is one of them across in countries right across Europe. But the core of it seems to be that unless you can re-inject hope into people's aspirations and dreams of the future, then you are going to have a dissatisfaction with the political systems, however well governments may deal with the turbulent currents that exist at present. However well they deal, you're not going to re-establish hope until we get back to a position of growth. And I think that is the core that underlies so much of what has happened.
Well, thank you, Sir John. That's a very fundamental point on which perhaps we can...
Can you take one there?
Oh, okay. If you're happy taking another one,
no,
we'll
I have to tell
one.
you, in 40 years of politics, I know I'm going to regret this.
We'll see, Sir John. The government's Brexit negotiations, Theresa May's Brexit negotiations, have been framed by her view that the vote meant we have to control immigration, we should not be subject to the European Court of Justice, and we should pay no money into the EU budget. Is she right in your view that that is what British people felt they were voting for? And very briefly, when you were Prime Minister, you got a little bit frustrated at Margaret Thatcher trying to backseat drive, especially on Europe. Are you doing that for Theresa May?
I would have been very happy for Margaret to make one speech every 8 months. And since I'm not going to backseat, and I'm not backseat driving, I very much wish Theresa to succeed. And for the reason I set out in my speech. Because when she stood on the steps of Downing Street and set out her social ambitions were exactly what I had in mind when I talked about a classless society on the day I went into Downing Street. I had impediments to achieve that. And I understand how difficult it is going to be. So I understand exactly why Theresa is where she is, and circumstance often pushes governments in a particular position. But I think that particular ambition she set out is really one that could change the face of British politics, and I wholeheartedly endorse it and support her in doing that. So I have no intention now or on any other occasion of being, I think the phrase you used was, a backseat driver. And apart from that, as my wife so frequently told me, I was an extremely bad front seat driver. Anyway, so the back seat has no attractions for me.
And this issue about control of immigration and not being subject to the ECJ, is that what the British people voted for?
Well, I think people all voted for their own individual reasons. I mean, since the, this partly relates to the last question, since the referendum, I have had a very large postbag from people who voted Remain of all parties, Labour Party, Liberal Party, of no parties, setting out their concerns. And also people who wrote to me explaining why they voted Leave. And I have a stack of letters of people saying, I voted Leave because my disability benefit wasn't increased. I voted Leave because my Member of Parliament won't answer my questions. All sorts of things quite important on their own, absolutely important on their own. And I wouldn't underplay their importance, but very different from the fundamental question of whether we should be in or out of Europe. So it was an accumulation of grievance, and the question we were asked in the middle when I talked about economies actually illustrates that it was an accumulation of grievances. The 48% who voted Remain voted on one issue. They just voted because they wanted to remain. But the 52% who voted to leave may have wanted to leave. I can't be clear what is in their mind. But many of them appear to have said later and written that other issues were predominant in their mind. So I'm afraid I wouldn't be so, I'm not so perceptive as to know exactly what was in people's minds. And now I'm no longer in politics, I don't have to pretend that I know.
May I, on behalf of this enthusiastic audience, thank you very much for those comments, your perspective, giving us a new phrase to think about of lapse in detail. I think that's much better than false news. And indeed for giving us a personal example of what you recommended in terms of decency, civility, and understanding. I think that is what we all need, and you've certainly given us some tonight. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.